I really am appreciative for all of you coming out on such a beautiful day to spend some time with me for this State of the System address in 2016. And of course, there's always a few preliminaries to get out of the way, and I want to do that obviously here at the outset before we get into some of the substance. I put a generic term introductions on there because you're never quite sure who's going to show up, and this will be the same set of slides used both at Edwardsville and Springfield tomorrow, and you kind of take stock of the crowd and look who needs an introduction. And I have a couple of those folks today. We'll get them to give a wave. We'll get them all kind of acknowledged here, all folks from the city of Carbondale, and then give them a round of thanks. We have Mayor Mike Henry here. Mayor, you'll give a wave. Chief of Police Jeff Grubbs back there. Maybe a couple city council members, but our own Carolyn Harvey here. So give them a round of thanks for coming out today to be part of what we do. So you note this is a little new attempt at format for me. Last year, for those of you who are here, I stood behind the podium and was somewhat extemporaneous and used slides, but still followed to some degree a script, and I'm trying to get away from that this year. So all the reporters who called and want an advanced script, they didn't get one. We'll share the PowerPoints, of course. So to some degree, it's in the manner of a TED Talk. I know many of you watch those. Unfortunately, I can't get mine done in 17 minutes. That's the problem, as I'm often reminded. And for those of you who know me, I gild the lily a little bit, and that'll be probably some problem today, although I have a time in my mind that I want to get us to so that we can then enjoy each other's company some more at the reception. The other danger when you do something like this, coming up unscripted, is the fact that it needs to be more in the style of a TED Talk than a Trump Talk. We don't want one of those taking place today, so I am going to try to stay away from that. Let me share some caveats as I go through these slides fairly quickly, in no particular order. You're going to hear reference at times to some business principles, practices, approaches, models. So Dean Clark, for everyone in your faculty, they won't be too bothered by that. They'll be used to hearing that nomenclature, and it won't be too disruptive. For some in other fields, maybe the humanities, etc., you're going to hear these terms, and you'll want to flinch a little bit. But don't. When I use those principles or models, we're applying them organizationally. It's not to suggest that the university is a business. It's not to suggest that I'm buying into this corporatization of higher education that we hear so much about. It's not to suggest that I think the road ahead for SIU Carbondale or any of our universities in the SIU system is to become, to use a phrase I've turned a bit lately, a community college on steroids. That's not what we're about, but we're going to look at some of those terms from business as we go through. Another caveat, I'm thinking about things at the system level. It's a state of the system speech, right? So I'm looking at things organizationally related to the SIU system for the most part. But in good organizations, well-functioning organizations, all of the units are nested within one another. So even if we're talking about a program area or a department, working up through a college, working up through a vice chancellor area, whatever the case may be, when a complex organization works well, it's because there's some nesting of these units. So what I would suggest to you is where the opportunity arises as we talk about some things, to look at what that could mean for your administrative unit or your budgetary area. Are there principles here that could be applied? Probably the last thing I should share at the front end, on a couple of occasions I might use some hypotheticals. I might say within the department of X, we should think about Y. Well, these are hypotheticals only, and they're not meant to call anybody out. So if somewhere along the way I make fun of the English department, it's not because I think we need to be fixing English or shouldn't have English or don't value all of the work that goes on in that great department. Rather, it's because it's a hypothetical, so I don't want anyone being bothered by that if I pick on your department. English? No. We'll see where that goes. We're going to do a question and answer at the conclusion of this. If you would, be thinking about what those questions would be. We're going to try to just run mics around the room. I don't want to have a line of 10 people around, but we'll just try to get to you as best we can as the time allows. Anything's fair game. You know, I thought about doing something where you write out the questions on a card. This is very typical in a lot of conference settings and that type of thing, similar to this, and I decided against it. But I would please caution you, to the extent you can, think through in a cogent manner that question you want to ask. Again, anything's fair game. But we probably don't want to hear a 10-minute history of your 30 years at SIU and different things that have happened over that time. Rather, have the question well phrased, get to the point, and let's talk about that a little bit as I try to stumble through with an answer. You know, it was really tough thinking about this State of the System speech. And in one case, and you know, I know many people on the Carbondale campus, and one of the great things about being back is that I get a chance to see people again. You get together for lunches or run into folks from the university at different events on campus or elsewhere. And because of that relationship that's established, you get kind of a free-flowing conversation. And one from the faculty here at one time asked, why even bother to do that State of the System speech anyway, right? There's no requirement per se. There's nothing in my contract or in the policies of the university that say we have to do this. So why bother? And as this individual faculty member pointed out, the system really doesn't do much anyway. And there's some truth to that. Anything good and productive and of value takes place at the campus level and works its way up. Even things that the system tries to be supportive of or sponsor gets done by the people on the campuses. Nonetheless, I still think there's value in it, but then the problem was created around how to anchor or frame the words I want to share. You know, I could spend some time today talking about, and I don't think it's an overstatement, talking about the trauma that all of our public universities in Illinois have experienced this past year. And again, I don't think it's a term that's beyond the pale. If you look at all that's gone on across the entire public university system in our beloved state, it has been traumatic. And we could think about particularly the human cost at SIU. We've tried to hold the center together. We've tried to stay away from layoffs, not do furloughs, keep people employed, but this has cost people jobs, particularly our non-tenure track faculty, particularly our people who are on grant dollars from the state of Illinois, other contracts, and we have lost them. And we hope that we're able to bring them back. So there's a human cost to this. We could have looked at the financial element and put up 50 or 60 slides. I've got a couple in here, so just get ready. But put up 50 or 60 slides looking at the financial impact of all that we've experienced here in Illinois over about the past year and a half or even beyond. But that misses something too. I could go into a political diatribe and try to predict for you what I think is going to happen as we get past the legislative elections here in 24 days, 23 days, see what impact that has on governance in the state of Illinois. Can action take place in the lame duck session after the holidays? Where will things go from here? I could try to prognosticate that. Some of my friends in the room know the old line I fall back on. I can predict everything but the future. So we'll probably not anchor around political prognostication. So once again have kind of come to what I think the role should be of these big once-a-year state of the, insert whatever organization you wish, speech. And for that there were three things that I keep coming back to, particularly in thinking about a State of the System speech at SIU. First of all, it should be forward-looking. We should be reaching out. So while I'm not going to give political prognostications or try to put you to sleep with a bunch of financial charts and that type of thing, I think we need to be talking about what lies ahead. what is coming, even though it's hard to see the shape of that as we sit here right now. It is not going to be about recounting successes because, again, at the system level, the successes come from the campus. You can read about some of the things that go on. Chancellor Caldwell gave a great State of the University address back in September that really revisited some of those things that have been accomplished at SIU Carbondale, rightfully so. But for me, it's not going back and looking at those because that's something that belongs to the campus. But I do think I need to talk about what lies ahead for all of us within SIU. I'm going to share some things in my comments that may be seen as prioritizing about where we go, what we do, how we do it in this new world ahead. But it is not my role, and I'll maybe be fairly forceful and direct in suggesting some things for what lies ahead. But it is not my role as the system president to prescribe for any campus what should take place as we deal with all that we're facing right now. And again, not just from the state level, but also the challenges we have around enrollment, keeping our human capital here at the university not being poached, and that type of thing. So you'll hear some very direct ideas that I have about how we reshape ourselves for the future, but in terms of how that turns into something actionable, that has to come from the campus. It has to emerge. It has to be something that's organic and makes its way. Finally, I'm going to try to be a little bit more strategic, even more so than last year, which, as I look back on it, wasn't much of a state of the system address for reasons I'll share with you in a few minutes. But to try to be more strategic as we think from here, especially as we've got this amorphous, unclear future ahead of us as we gather today. So we think in strategic ways, but not simplistic ways, I hope. So one of the things that you get to do when you're a chancellor or a president, if you're so inclined, you get to read a whole bunch of State of the University addresses from around the country. Can you imagine how exciting that is? So you have any number of presidents and chancellors all over the United States who are just so certain that the group of presidents nationwide wants to read their words of wisdom, that they publish these and send them out in nice booklets, and we all get them. And so far, I've gotten a few. Obviously, a number of these addresses get done earlier in the fall than what I'm doing at the time the chancellor did his. So all of these booklets are starting to come, and weirdly enough, yes, it says something about me, I suppose. Weirdly enough, I look at some of these, and you know the thing that distinguishes a lot of them, and it's not to be insulting to my fellow chancellors and presidents, but what distinguishes them is that there's no there. I don't want to use the word pabulum, but it's pretty thin gruel to come talk about a future direction for a university. Now, obviously, I'm not naming who this is, and I suppose you could go back, play because there's no script, go back, play a video, transcribe it, load it up to Google and see whose speech this was, but please don't. So this is language from an address, State of the University address. And I can tell you, having read the entire thing, it doesn't get any better. So here it is. Because of you, we are a leading national university with a global reputation. This is not just a vision. It is our reality, and we live it every day. We are a great university, but great universities don't stand still. Every day, we must set our sights higher for the sake of our students, our communities, and the world around us. That is the heart of our mission as a public university. It is the guiding principle that has driven, insert the name of the university, from the beginning. What does that say? Very little, with apologies to the president who I stole it from. So we're going to try to be a little more strategic and direct. Another thing that I read every so often is another state of the system speech. And if anybody wants a copy, zip me an email, we can give it to you. And that's from the late president of the SIU system, James Walker. And here's what he said in his State of the System address 15 years ago. I don't like reading slides, but I'm going to do that here. We must not overlook the possibilities for maximizing the resources at our disposal. We need to find our niche and allocate resources accordingly. That means setting priorities. It means making tough decisions about which programs should be expanded and which should be eliminated and or curtailed. You can see my heading on that. Have we progressed in 15 years' time? Oh, we've changed. We've been traumatized. We've gone through churning and turbulence in a couple of occasions, particularly coming out of the Great Recession, as well as now, where we've been stressed and stretched to the maximum. But in terms of what President Walker was talking about here, I don't know so much. I'm not so sure that that's been the case. What he called for, what he saw, he was prescient. What he saw 15 years ago, I'm not sure we ever really took on. And that's nobody's fault. It's not to make a qualifying judgment about anyone, anything, any institution. Not at all. Rather, we'd always been able to navigate our way through, to figure out our way to the next day, the next year. But President Walker's words are back, and we're going to have to heed them, I do believe. You don't want me spending a lot of time reciting last year's State of the System address. For those of you who are here, you took your measure of it. If you weren't, you didn't miss much maybe. But I do want to just hit it quickly because I'm going to come back and talk about that in a minute in terms of a critique and trying to contrast last year with what we're doing this year. So there were chunks of the speech, right? I always look at any kind of address in kind of 3 or 4 big chunks. There was one big chunk where I talked about the 3 eras of SIU, and these were divided into about 70 to 75-year pieces. The first 70 years or so, from 1869 on into the late 40s, early 50s, that was the establishment of SIU. And the coming out of the ground with the facilities and the programs and really setting that footprint for what SIU would be. Starting with President Morris's tenure, the drastic, massive, amazing expansion of SIU in terms of physical plant, in terms of programs, particularly at the graduate level, in terms of the things that were done around public service, in terms of our political clout. In all of these areas, it was really, in some ways, an almost unbelievable time. If you go back and read 2 or 3 of the histories that exist, and they're out there, again, I can zip you an email if you want to know them. In fact, one of the books, we still have a number of in the office, and I'll probably give you one if you want one. Almost unbelievable to think that all that went on, starting with President Morris, and really extending up through President Pashard's time. And then I referenced that 3rd era we're moving into, retrenchment, because of our financial challenges, the budget difficulties, where that retrenchment takes place with a pulling back. And I think I even put last year the definition of retrenchment in a slide, and it's that almost unthinkable notion for a university of pulling in, shrinking, becoming less. And that's what we're moving into in some ways. And then I walked through what is emblematic of an organization, a university, a state in retrenchment. You can see those things. I might suggest to you that really nothing has changed here. Nothing in some ways has clarified anymore. But all of these components or elements still exist, and we deal with them. And then I listed off a bunch of tactics. All right, if we're in this era of retrenchment, if this is what retrenchment is, what does it call us to do as a university? That was the question. And I listed off in bullets a bunch of these more tactical approaches. Again, you can read them here, and they'd be the type of thing that you would typically think of, right? It's what we've done before in our history at SIU when encountering similar challenge on a smaller scale. It's what other state universities are dealing with, not just in Illinois, but around the country, experiencing these same impacts. And then I closed out with one other element. I'm going to come back to that because it's going to be the closer for today, just as it was a year ago, which really is what defines us at SIU. Now, in thinking about the speech then, right, I'm trying to figure out, as I shared earlier, an angle, an anchor, something to attach this thing to as a means for framing comments and talking to you today. Another thing that I thought about, beyond politics, beyond finance, beyond the human toll, the trauma generally, another thing I thought about was just listing out some more tactics. You know, come together today, bemoan the fact that in Illinois, things have not changed appreciably. In fact, in many ways have gotten much worse. We have no more clarity today than we did a year ago on how this gamesmanship is going to play out to the bitter end. So I could have said, you know, we've really got to double down on these tactics and go through these types of things here. And those aren't bad. Those aren't bad things. You heard the chancellor talking about the fact that at the Carbondale campus, he wants to pull down the number of administrators by about 5%. In addition to that, we have to deal with something that in organizational studies we think of as administrative overlap, where we have too many administrators dealing with the same problems, questions, and providing the same answers. It gums up the system, and I dare say we have some of that within SIU. I may be even more aggressive on the administrative piece, but I'm not announcing anything. So for a few of you who came, and this is another good faculty friend of mine, for those of you who came thinking we're going to list out a whole set of cuts today, and you're going to get the marching orders, no, I don't prescribe. But there may be something on administration that we're going to have to think about system-wide, and that is putting a true freeze on for any managerial supervisory employee. I'm not talking about AP staff. I'm talking about managerial supervisory employees, and before we allow any of those replacements to happen throughout the system, basically have those reviewed at the system level to see if we can double up on duties, tasks, and responsibilities. Chancellor, I've not issued that order yet, so don't worry about it yet. But we've got to get a handle on this. We have to do more grassroots political activity. We're working with the Alumni Association to figure out how we can bring them along, as other alumni associations have in the state of Illinois, who are working with their state universities to be stronger, louder advocates for us, to have that work directed in a little better fashion. Another important tactic. Obviously, we have to keep doing that third bullet. I'm not going to put up the rings. Everybody's tired of seeing those from the time I was chancellor. But one of the tactics that we continue to work on is look at those activities that are to some degree around the public service effort of the university that go beyond the teaching and learning that takes place in classrooms and laboratories and on farms and in studios and the support work around that, such as libraries and advisement, but really thinking about very important work, by the way, but that third ring or outer tier work, and we've got to just keep doing more and more to bring those units to a state of self-sufficiency. Not in a knee-jerk reaction, not without time to transition, but we have to keep about that as a tactic, and that includes athletics, by the way, because we had the stopgap measure that came through this last June. To some degree, they dodged a bullet. Everyone in that outer ring dodged some bullets, I might suggest, based upon the state money that, while not sufficient, allowed us to keep doing a lot of what we're doing, albeit in a lessened form, a less dynamic way, but athletics has to be part of that too. And then, of course, all of the campuses are working on program review, reprioritization, And I salute that work. It's not easy, but I know it's something that the campus is taking on and seeking to come to some decisions around as we work through this year. So, as I say, if you think about a critique of last year's, it was really somewhat simplistic. It was tactically based. It was trying to say, if we can just figure out how to do this list of things, it will protect us, it will allow us to keep doing what we're doing in generally the same way. Yes, I know, with less people and having to scale back and not enough to keep all of our units running the way we've been able to run them and achieve success. But still, it was a tactical approach. There was another problem with last year, and that was the use of the word retrenchment. And by the way, you're asking yourself, well, how did you come to all these decisions about last year's speech? I went back and I looked at it, and I thought about it in light of where we are 1 year later. And as I tried to build from that in somewhat larger narrative to this year, and then even on to 2017, wherever that may take it, one thing that really bothered me was that use of the term retrenchment for the third era, because you know what that suggests? It suggests retreat. And we're building with the use of that term and just talking about these tactics, we're building this narrative that plays right into what some of those who are watching us in the state and beyond kind of want us to do. Pull back, get smaller, get away from the front lines. That is not the thing we can do at this time. It's the biggest mistake we could make. The other big problem, in addition to the use of the term retrenchment, which entails this running away from the fight, if I can use that military metaphor. Or is that an analogy? I don't know where the English professors are. But it's getting away from the line of battle. We can't do that. The other problem with last year's speech is it was framed around this notion, as I've said, if we only get the right tactics, if we only find those things on a list that we start doing, we'll be able to navigate our way through this. We'll be able to buy the time until this titanic struggle for the soul of Illinois plays out, until our dysfunctional governance structure, and these are all good people, when I use that term, don't go beating up on our elected officials or calling the governor. Please don't do that. But it's a systemic issue. It's a systemic issue. So these tactics that I listed out kind of ignored all that. If we can just find this right set of things to do, we'll make our way through and we'll be back here in 2016 and everything's good. And we've survived it. And we move on from here in pretty much generally the same way we've always operated. I don't think so this time. I don't think so. And the tactics suggested, if we can, again, just get the right tricks out of the trick box or quivers out of the arrow, we get through this. A year passed, I'm not necessarily sold on that now. The reason for that is we're in the midst right now of this grand reshaping of the state university covenant. And where we thought about higher education as a public good, not a cost center, you remember those words I think I shared last year. As we move away from education, particularly higher education, as a public good, as something you do for an economic investment of the state to build the commonweal. As we move away from that, the tactics aren't going to work. Now, I'm not giving up on the fact that the covenant may still hold after we see the end of the political struggle. I'm not giving up on that at all. And I can tell you we have many, many people on both sides of the aisle, not just in elected office, but other positions of influence, who know the value, the importance, the strength of having a great public university system in a state like Illinois. They can recall 20 years ago, 22 years ago, when we were among the best state system in the nation. And they mourn the fact of where we've come 20 to 22 years later. But I do think that we're in this period that we may well undergo a reshaping that causes us to enter into a different covenant with the state. And you may be saying, well, what does this mean? What are you talking about? This sounds a little bit like the guy's speech I stole. It's going to look at things like the degree programs that the state continues to be willing to pay for. It's going to question how many of a certain degree that we need in the state of Illinois. Some may think right now that there's a discussion that's playing out by default, not done in an affirmative way, but a discussion that's playing out by default right now as to how many state universities we need. I can't read people's minds. I don't know if that's the case or not. About what is the state support tuition mix? Questions about how many administrators or in what areas do we support administration? And there I am talking about AP staff, by the way. Although they're after administrators too. Just so you're aware, SIU, for this campus, among the research institutions, Edwardsville, among the comprehensive campuses in the state, and SIU at a system level, we all have the lowest administrative ratios in our sector. So, there. But the state's going to be looking at this very carefully and dictating to us, possibly, defining for us, telling us, sometimes by default, as we see 2 or 3 of our state universities right now crumbling under us, being dismantled as we sit here today and go through particularly this academic year. So we've got to look strategically about how we're ready to respond to that, depending upon how that covenant gets remade. If it does, it may not. But if it does, you know, one of the things we're trying very hard to do across all of SIU, and I know it doesn't feel like it at times, as you see people losing their jobs, as you see programs getting reeled in, as we take travel money away, as in some departments we can't even buy paper. But as all this is going on, we still are doing our best to hold that core of what it means to be a university together. If you think about the academic programs, the research that takes place, the critical student services, I dare say even the public service work we do, everyone is trying their hardest. And I don't just mean administrators. I mean, I know all of us are trying our hardest to hold that center together, to keep that core. Because once we go in and start pulling out of it, once we start dismantling it, once we start letting it crumble and cave away, it's probably not coming back. It's probably not coming back. So while we've got difficult decisions to make, we try to hold that center. All right, moving on. I'm watching my time. I am going to do a couple of slides, and I think my last point is made. You get the drift, as I'm sometimes want to say. It's going to be something that's transformational, an affirmative approach that we take to redefine, do things in different ways, think about how we use the strengths that we have to deal with this covenant that's changing in front of us and be better in a strategic sense. 2 charts quickly. There they are. One of the reasons I think we're not going to go back to the old covenant, I'd love it, but one of the reasons I don't think we're going to go back to the old covenant is the chart that you see here. And basically, for those students of Illinois politics, what you see here is what we refer to as the pension ramp. So that, I don't know, Matt, where did Matt go? I lost him. Others will know this. The pension ramp started in 1995. Sound right? Somebody's nodding. Anyway, I know this. It goes out to about 2045. We only cover it to 17 here, but you know what that ramp does? Goes just like that. And you can see the impact that it's having in the red bar on how much money is being spent by the state to cover our retirement obligations as a university system, again, not just SIU, but across the state, and what that leaves for higher ed operations funding. Now, this is weird, right? Because we only got the April stopgap in 16, and even though we're using the second stopgap from June, remember way back then, to pay 16 bills, we did have to book that as revenue. So that's why money being spent in 17. The point of this chart is this, and that's not going to change. It's not going to change. Another problem we have, you've seen this possibly, it's difficult to read, don't worry about it, you'll get the drift. The state of Illinois now for about 9 years has had a goal referred to as 60 by 25. And the idea of that, you can see the stair-step progression here, is by the year 2025 to get to 60% of the Illinois populace that has either a degree, a credential, some sort of high-end license or what have you. And you can see that we did okay in the early years of that. In fact, to some degree as a state outperformed in just degree production, but we've started to fall off, and with the challenges in the state, that's going to continue to fall off, and we're going to lose track on that 60 by 25 goal. Well, there you may say, well, why worry about that a whole lot? You know, it's a goal, it's aspirational, don't lose sleep over that. Here's the worry that I have that causes me to think the covenant is changing. The sands are shifting. And that is the fact we're hearing about performance funding in Illinois taking a tenfold increase. Now, we haven't seen it yet. And not much money is driven to the universities now by performance funding. But the general discussion among the politigentsia, if I can invent that word, is, you know, if we're going to be able to ever drive more state support to the public universities, it's probably going to be somehow through performance funding. I would suggest to you that if we charted that out for SIU Carbondale, we're even more challenged. All right, enough of the doom and gloom. You get the point. Strategic response. What goes into that? Nothing new for all of you. You know about these things. First of all, there's some vision of the external environment that exists. And for those of you that know anything about strategic planning or organizational studies, you know, Terry, this would be called the environmental scan, wouldn't it? You're looking at that landscape that's in front of us or that we're working upon and trying to figure out what that looks like to then look at new organizational structures, different ways to use resources, the deployment of human talent in a fashion maybe we haven't done in the past, new technology that exists, all of these things that are under our control to try to address what that new landscape looks like, what that new covenant's going to be. But as I said, we only have a very nebulous view of that new environment. Nonetheless, it doesn't get us off the hook for at least thinking about how to make sense of that. So these are the things we work with, not listing out a set of tactics, not coming up with a bunch of bullet points that we share to say if we only do this, it gets us out of it. Rather, to start maneuvering, manipulating, experimenting with these broader elements of organizations as listed in the second bullet. And things need to hang together conceptually. So this is where I'm going to introduce you to the strategy wheel. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I'm watching my time and we still want to get a few questions in. But all of the elements that come together to be part of a strategy for an organization, particularly a university, have to have a relationship to one another, have to hang together. So I'm going to show you in a second this strategy wheel. It's not mine. It's an adaptation. We'll see how many business profs, Terry, know this name. Pangaj Gemawat, Indian economist, now teaching in Spain. A guru of organizational strategy, global strategy. And he came up with this notion of the strategy wheel and said, for business organizations, there's these elements that kind of come together that you use to deal with strategy, to act upon strategy. So I looked at his wheel, and you can find this with a little searching in Harvard Business Review. It's where the article was published where he laid this out. And he said, here are the elements of global business. Well, we're not global business, but we are a complex organization, and look to see if we could relate this to a university. So there we go. Mission and purpose at the center, and then those other components you see listed: students and programs, operations and organization, mission and purpose at the center, the core, identity and reputation, and then human capital and innovation. We're going to look at each of these in pretty short order. Mission and purpose. We've got to do things strategically that show our distinctiveness as an institution, not just at the campus level, but at the system level. We have to figure out what are the things that pull students to us, that bring investment to us, that cause funders to say, we need to think about SIU, that put us on various political maps to differentiate us from everyone else who's out there. Many ways to do this. I'm not going to take time to go into that. But if we don't start to set ourselves apart so that, for instance, SIUC looks different from an Illinois state, an Indiana state, Western Michigan University, go ahead and start listing out your institutions, we're going to have a hard time getting through this. Second point, it's very difficult to keep doing things in an across-the-board manner if you want to operate strategically. And I know when we were looking at this tactically, this being keeping the university on four wheels, moving forward and out of the ditch, we've tended to rely on across-the-board tactics. Strategically, it's going to be very difficult for us to keep doing that, and you're going to see differential decision-making take place. And it's not just about cuts, it's not just about where to send new hires, it's not about just that, it's also about figuring out how we invest in different ways and do things differentially. And then obviously we look to others who are in a similar situation. Those universities, institutions similarly situated, see how they're dealing with the same challenges successfully and seek to change strategy accordingly. Students and programs. I'm going to let you read those yourselves. My guess is that you can make sense of those and understand meaning from them. But let me say a couple of points. When we talk about repositioning, it's really something that you look at in a very, in fact, we could kind of deal with those first two in related fashion. When you think about repositioning, it may be looking at what are the new program areas that we need to be thinking about, possibly letting some slew off. Where do we go in recruitment? How do we teach large 100 and 200 level courses? Are there other places we should go off campus? What's our online presence? All of these elements go into this repositioning. So it's not just talking about the major organizational structures that you might think about. Should we take all of the academic colleges, wipe them out, and create schools? That would be a big organizational element, obviously. but it's also in looking at new ways to do the work that we have, going to new places to do that work, thinking about it in making a new set point for not just the system, but also all of the underlying units. And then I have to say this because any great university is always going to key off that student relationship. Sometimes we forget about that. We think about our disciplines that we represent. We think about the challenges that we have sometimes in repositioning ourselves, whether it's with new programs, whether it's figuring out how to go to new places, do different things. If we ever abandon the nature of that student transaction that takes place, and really we should use the word transformation, we're going to have a very difficult time moving ourselves forward. And we can get better about that at SIU Carbondale. It's not just in the work that many of you do engaging our students in instructional matters and academic affairs, but it's also our customer service work that we do on the campus that we always have to keep thinking about as we look at ways to support our students as they navigate this place we call SIU Carbondale. Operations and organizations. Again, you can see the bullets. I won't read them. But we do many things as far as operations, as far as the way we get decision-making handled, as far as how we establish functional responsibilities that really slow us down. It's been something that's been I'll say a factor that at SIU Carbondale in some ways has made us a little slow to respond at times to the actions that you all are trying to take in your units to reposition, to do things more strategically. So we've got to figure out ways to look toward action, to figure out how to get things accomplished, decided upon in a little more rapid fashion, and to have a management style that looks at us thinking about means or ways that we can say yes to things as opposed to no all the time. Now that doesn't mean the shackles come off and it's a free-for-all at SIU Carbondale. But rather, this bent we have many times for folks in my position is to say, no, we can't do that because it saves us having to deal with it. It doesn't demand for us to invest time in a solution. And like all administrators, it's easy just to say, no, we can't go there, not going to do it that way, won't spend the money, etc. I'm going to try to have all of our administrative corps and ask all of you to share in that same thinking as you work within your units, deal with students. Is there a way we can figure out yes? As we approach things from that fashion, it will force us to think about new strategic approaches. Human capital innovation is another one of those strategic components or elements. Even as we get in the worst of times, we have to keep investing in human capital. The university is a human service, human capital organization, institution. So even as things get tremendously difficult for us, particularly at this campus, budgetarily, if we just abandon investment in human capital, whatever that may mean, training for individuals who need it, providing some opportunity for a new tenure-track professor for those we still have here, to invest time to build the tenure record, in looking at needs of departments, particularly if there's a desire to invest in something new that will bring students or help us in the strategic approach. We can't give up on that. This holds true for talent pools who are out there. It's kind of a related bullet, isn't it? Even though we feel so often that we're in this mode of shrinking and pulling ourselves in, we still have to figure out where we invest in talent and bring new people to the university to help us answer that strategic demand. Obviously, I talked about the markets, and we also have to figure out better, more frequent sophisticated ways to communicate across the system, not just on the campus, but the system as a whole, where everyone has knowledge of that broad direction we're trying to take, that future landscape that we're trying to overlay ourselves on. It increases understanding and helps everyone in this 7,000 plus organization we call SIU to figure out his or her role, what to do to play. Identity and reputation is the last one. We need to do everything we can to strengthen what I refer to here as the one firm brand. That is not my nomenclature. I found that also in a business reference that I read. But please understand that as we're thought about as a system in the state of Illinois, people know the SIU brand for any host of reasons, even possibly things that don't take place on this campus. It burnishes that brand, extends us out as we all bask in each other's reflected glory. It extends us out to the state and region in ways that you can't imagine. So it doesn't mean that we're one university. No, I'm not saying that. But rather, SIU as a system is a brand that, as we build upon the strengths of the system, are going to push us out to many, many more people who will take interest, who can help us, guide us, and respond to these strategic changes we're trying to make. If we ever abandon the public service role at SIU, we're sunk. This is our DNA. Now, it doesn't mean we do everything we always have done in the same way, using the same amount of state dollars, and not change strategically. Oh no, I've already gone through and said that's not the idea. But neither can it be this cutting off of an entire chunk of our being, the third leg of the stool, to say, well, we just got to get out of this business and can't do it anymore. Again, this is a defining element. So we have to figure out in this strategic approach ways to keep that work as part of it. We have a leadership role to play in this state, and this is a speech to me. Remember, I said I'm thinking at a system level, but to the extent that it's nested in other layers, look at it yourself. For the people you know, for those of influence, for elected officials, for thought leaders. Use the leadership role we have as the second jewel in the crown for the state of Illinois higher education. And carry that message strategically about that we're trying to do to address what's been put in front of us. And if we don't have trust at all levels, organizationally, down to individually, at every one of those units, those who we need to come with us on this journey are going to step away. Whether it's parents of our students, our alumni, again, members of the General Assembly, our donors. Anytime we violate that trust, we're losing someone who's going to help us go back to that front line and fight the battle. My time's up. I'm not going to talk about the system strategic plan. Simply understand that the Board of Trustees and myself are trying to pivot our work to be more strategic in our approach. And toward that end, we've kind of come back again to looking at a system strategic plan, trying to identify the actions and initiatives at a system level that a board can oversee, that I can take some responsibility for, to get us that strategic response. And if you're interested in looking at that, you can go to the SIU system, all one word, siusystem.edu website. Go under the Board of Trustees link. You can see the draft plan that's out for comment and review now. And I'm going to be talking to a few groups on campus about it through this fall. Give me your feedback individually if you wish. But that's going to be done with a generative approach. We're not going to build a large booklet with 150 goals in it. It's going to be rather something that's generative, setting out these broad strategic areas or themes with some actionable items under that, and then we're going to look for opportunities where we can do things that emerge, that things present themselves. Now, if you want to ask why that approach, because that's how I do strategic planning. Just think of a university campus on September 10th, 2001, that did a big strategic plan, 150 components to it, got it passed by its board, had a big celebration party for the strategic plan. And let's also assume that on that September 10th, 2001 University Strategic Plan, the number one goal said we're going to increase international enrollment by 25%. That plan was dead in the water 24 hours from there. That's why I'm not a big fan of 150 goals. Rather, you'll see themes. We look to take opportunities that come to us and build from those themes. And again, enough said on that. You can go look. You'll see this reference there. Strategic planning is not the only type of planning. I put this up here simply to make reference to a couple of other things we do. The board has worked very hard over the past year to look at foundational performance and have some metrics around that. So again, if you go to that siusystem.edu website and look at a tab called Data and Reports, we've actually put together some dashboard indicators that look at the functional health, the organizational health of the institutions across a full range of sectors. They're not fancy graphics. We didn't pay money for it. We did it all in-house. We'll maybe dress it up as years go by and finances allow. But if you're wanting to see some measure of overall institutional effectiveness, our health as a system, look at that. We also spend time looking at special purposes and doing planning on that. Right now, the biggie that's in front of us at the system level, as requested by our board, is on diversity and inclusiveness. And the board has passed a framework that has some things for the system to get involved in. Again, not campus activities, not a campus diversity plan, but things at the system level that we think can move the needle. And then here is where the work takes place to identify areas for this aspirational progress, that big change that we're facing as we deal with, I hate this term anymore, the new normal, but the new covenant that I think we see coming. These are things we need to do in a new strategic reality. Get ready with the questions. Anybody need that explained? I mean, it's self-explanatory, pretty intuitive. One thing we're not great about at SIU is taking risks. And we're going to have, and I'm talking to the board about this as well, these are not uncalculated risks. These are not risks where we don't try to mitigate the dangers that are out there. But we're going to have to get a little less risk averse as a university and try some things in different ways, or we are not going to strategize our way out of what lies ahead. Another thing that and I'm not picking on anybody, any office, any university here. Another thing that we tend to do, in part because of administrative turnover over the years, we chase a different rabbit out of the field every time we turn around. Got to stop it. We got to decide what the strategies are to work, to invest in, to make real change, and then stick with them long enough to see if the darn things work. I already talked about this earlier. This is difficult, particularly for faculty. Everyone's come up with their programs. We talk about data-driven decision-making. You don't do anything in your research without having the numbers in front of you. And the problem when we have to have change of the type that I think we're going to be called upon to do in this turbulent environment, sometimes you have to act without a lot of information. So that's in front of us too. But in the end, what holds us together, what is going to remain the touchstone for how we move forward, are these values that we share as a university. We can make all kinds of decisions. We can create new strategies. We can reposition. We can reinvent, reset. But the touchstone for all that we do has to be the values. Remember, I don't prescribe, so the way we get there is loosely coupled. Every department, every program, every college, every unit should be thinking for itself about how they deal with the challenges in those previous slides as we see the landscape form, as the covenant starts to be framed in front of us. We hope over the next year or so. But whatever the case, however that unfolds in front of us, we have to stay anchored. These have to be our tethers for those many decisions, big decisions, I sense, that we're going to be called to make going forward. All right, we are going to do Tom with one mic, Matt with another mic. We do have the reception ready to go. So, again, we're going to do this quick hits. I'm not making you write the question, but we'll do a few of these. And unless I've talked you to death. All right, floor's open. Oh, thank God. All right. I knew I wouldn't get off scot-free.
Hi, Stephen Kraft, former employee and department chair for a number of years. My question has to deal with the renegotiation of the covenant that you've been referring to. And could you be a bit more specific in terms of who is actually doing the renegotiation? Is this something coming out of the governor's office? Is this something which is happening in a ill-planned way through the lack of legislative leadership? Is it through the IBHE and an activity which is happening there? Is there any negotiation coming from our end?
Yes. Great question. And for me, I think of it in terms of kind of this cascading effect. So right now, everything's just caught at the top level. It's jammed up. There's a log jam. At the top level, between the governor and the General Assembly, some might say the governor and legislative leadership on the Democratic side, that until that unfreezes somehow, the cascade can't start. But let's acknowledge it could turn out to be the case, not knowing how this ends, that we might end up with not much of a new covenant. We could imagine, yes, a budget deal that maybe has new revenue coming in a fairly aggressive way, that gets us as state universities funded at, dare I say, an 88% level, a 90% level, a 92% level, if we go back to FY15 as our most recent normal or base year. If that turned out to be the case, there may not be much new covenant negotiating. We would kind of go back to where we were in previous days, where we were paying down the bills about $2 billion a year, and the pension payments were getting made, and the state universities, I think heading into that last year, got some cut. I think we ended up 2.2% or something like that. But so you get these haircuts. It could turn out that way. And that's not much of a new covenant, and maybe we can go back to more tactical approaches to figure out how we deal with that. What worries me, though, for the reasons I showed on a couple of the slides, I dare to think that's not going to happen. If you look at what the governor introduced in his FY16 budget that cut us 30%, kept the community colleges at level funding in for the FY17 budget, that proposal was about 25% reduction. If we see something like that at the end, that's a new covenant. So that tells us what we're working with budgetarily, financially. And then from there, one could suggest maybe it goes to the Board of Higher Education. I don't think so. So far, they have not been active, aggressive, and involved players. It's not to say they couldn't. I don't want to take anything away from the state agency for higher education. But right now, they've been on the sidelines. And they haven't been responsive to calls to think about, do we have duplication of degrees in the state of Illinois? If so, how do we deal with that? What is a low production program? How do we define that? They are getting more involved in that, obviously. So we'll see, maybe the Board of Higher Education gets given a goal there. From there, then, I think it will cascade down probably to the universities themselves to come together and say, all right, this new normal is a 70% level, 60, 80, whatever. And I right now think it's going to be for the universities themselves to decide how they deal with those numbers. And in that way, it's almost the covenant we're kind of creating ourselves right here, aren't we? And figuring it out as a university. I also think, though, that part of this is going to be caught up if we jump back up to the top level, the top of the pyramid, or where the cascading begins. I think part of this is also going to get caught up, too, in how many state universities we have at the end of this battle, this titanic struggle. And I really do think it's an open question right now. Nobody wants to see anyone close, and I put myself in that group. But I do think there's this kind of tacit policy, huge policy question right now out there in the state of Illinois. Do we need to have all of these state institutions? So that's all going to get caught up. We see what the budget turns out to be. I think it's going to skip the Board of Higher Ed to give us any guidance or direction unless they get muscled up more than they are now. And then we're going to see what that number is, and we come back together and figure it out. And it could be we have about like 12 covenants across state universities. Somebody else. But that's a good question. I'm going to be out here. We're going to all adjourn, or those who are able, I hope many of you can. We're going to adjourn over to the International Lounge. We've got our hospitality students who are working out there. I want to thank Jim Salmo at the foundation. His funding helped underwrite the reception out here tonight. You're going to see, again, students, give them a word of thanks. Vanessa Sneed, who handles events for the Chancellor's office, was a great help putting this together. The fact that you came out on a beautiful day, when so many of you, like me, could have been sitting out on our back porch, having our own glass of wine, but came here to invest in the future of SIU, means a great deal. We'll get a chance to talk out here. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for your time today.